We are in Revelation, the 16th chapter. In fact, we were reading the end of this 16th chapter when we ran out of time last week to tie together some of the last things that come about in this seventh chalice. So we've got to the seventh and final chalice that's being poured out. And with that, let's, so we have everything in context for this chalice. Let's start with verse 17 and read through the end of the chapter. In doing so, we read, "The seventh angel poured out his bowl into the air, and a loud voice came out of the temple and from the throne saying, 'It is done.' And there were flashings of lightning, rumbling, peals of thunder, and a great earthquake, such as there had never been since the man was on the earth. So great was that earthquake. The great city was split into three parts, and the cities of the nations fell. And God remembered Babylon the Great, to make her drain the cup of wine from the fury of the wrath. And every island fled away, and no mountains were to be found. And great hailstones, about 100 pounds, fell from heaven on the people. And they cursed God for the plague of the hail, because the plague was so severe." So we have this seventh and final chalice being poured out here. We noted last week in verse 17 that the statement's made, this loud voice comes out of the temple, "It is done." And we noted the similarity there to what Jesus said on the cross, meaning that the redemptive work of God on behalf of mankind on the cross was completed or was done. I believe what we see in verse 17 here is that God is stating from the temple in heaven is being stated that his judgment on Israel that has been prophesied from really the very beginning of the covenant in both Deuteronomy and Leviticus. Their destruction was prophesied if they did not keep his commandments and keep the covenant with him. And so it was said that he was going to pour out a sevenfold judgment on them. And as we get to the end of the seventh chalice, the statement's made, "It is done." And so with that, verse 18, there's flashes of lightning and rumbling and peals of thunder. And I believe that in this particular case that these are the sounds of battle, the great rumbling and carrying on of battle as Jerusalem finds her meets her final end in this great battle that takes place in 70 AD. Along with that, in 18, there's a great earthquake such as has never been before. And with that, I am mindful of Matthew 24 and 21, where prophesying the destruction of Jerusalem, Jesus said there's going to be a tribulation such as never been before and will never be after. And the idea of earthquakes throughout the book of Revelation have been used to symbolize the destabilization of governments. There's nothing more destabilizing than earthquakes. It's one thing for hurricanes and tornadoes that can be incredibly destructive, right, to destroy things. But for the very earth, the foundation under us to give way and bring about destruction is very destabilizing, as I've used that word a couple of times. And so I believe what Jesus is showing to John in that is that this judgment's final. Right? Israel was judged numerous times. The northern kingdom went into the Syrian captivity, southern kingdom by the Babylonians. In fact, the Babylonians in 586 BC completely destroyed the temple. This is something that's been done before, but not like this, because it was done in such a way that the Jewish nation will never recover. Certainly not as a kingdom before God is the very structure of their their covenant was destroyed. Questions or comments on any of that so far? In 19, then, we saw two very important things. Number one, the city, assuming we're talking about Jerusalem here, the city is split into three parts. You would assume this is from the earthquake. And what's interesting about that is history tells us that's exactly what happens. Jerusalem was divided into three parts. Titus, in the final days, takes over the first wall and into a portion of the city and utterly destroys it before going into the second section. Jerusalem had its very foundation, if you will, not physically, but its epicenter was the temple. So around the temple is this vast wall. The temple is very much like a fortress. And it was believed by the Jews to be impenetrable. That's why as the Romans are conquering all of Judea, people are fleeing to Jerusalem. Jesus had said, when this happens, get away from the cities. But they're fleeing to Jerusalem because they believe the temple is impenetrable. So that was built, the city was built around it, and then a wall around that city. As they grew and population grew, they spilled beyond those walls. And so the third section of the city was built, and then a large wall was outside that. So when Titus conquers Jerusalem, he takes the outermost ring, destroys it, takes the second inner ring, destroys it. And believe it or not, most historians believe, and at least Titus claimed that he did not want the temple destroyed. But he retreats to his quarters. You can imagine the exhaustiveness of the war. And his soldiers are in no mindset to save anything. And the greed, they want to get all that gold and all the precious metals in the temple. And so they completely destroy the temple, even setting it ablaze and burning it to the point that the gold and silver goes down into the cracks of the rocks. And so they bust the rocks apart and take every single rock apart to get every last bit of the gold and silver from the temple. So it falls in three sections, which is eerily similar to what's said here in verse 19. And with this, we read, "And God remembered Babylon the Great." Now, throughout this book, Jerusalem is called Babylon. And the first thing popped in my mind when I read that is God says, oh yeah, that's right, Babylon. But that's not the kind of remembrance that we read here. It's the same thing, and I have a note in my Bible for Luke 29:19, where our Lord and Savior says, do this, speaking of the Lord's Supper, do this in remembrance of me. Now, we don't come in here on Sunday and say, oh, that's right, Jesus died. Completely forgot. Like, no. We call it into remembrance, and we are, remember Paul said to the Corinthians, in fact, this is incorporated into most of the prayers that are offered at the Lord's Supper. He who does this in unworthy manner eats and drinks damnation unto their soul, or condemnation unto their soul. The idea is that we are sitting and we're giving him his worthy respect, right? That we're not focused on anything else. That we are doing it in a worthy manner because we're doing it in remembrance of him. I think what we have here is God is remembering Babylon, is remembering Jerusalem, having destroyed not only the prophets, but having, as he said in Matthew 21, tried to steal the inheritance as bad tenants would. And so he is repaying them their just due. And that, I think, is made a little more clear by the following statement: to make her drain the cup of wine of the fury of the wrath. So That judgment language. Questions or comments? Verse 20 says, and here's where we did not deal with this at all, and every island fled away, and no mountains were to be found. Mountains resemble or represent what throughout the book of Revelation?
Place for the people to flee when there was trouble. They fled to the mountains.
Okay. Yeah, in fact, if you're thinking of Matthew 24, Jesus says they'll say mountains fall in on us, right? Throughout the Old Testament, though, and throughout the book of Revelation, mountains referred to something very particular. Remember, earlier in this book, we read about a mountain being picked up and thrown into the sea. Nations. They represent great nations. Babylon, Egypt, Israel were all referred to as great mountains throughout the Old Testament. It's representing the idea that they're a strong nation. Right? Where was the leadership of the Jewish people, or the leaders of the Jews, where was their trust in the time of Christ, and this time for that matter?
In the Old Testament law.
The Old Testament law?
And their temple.
In their temple? Can you think of anywhere else? It's not; those aren't wrong. There was some amount of trust put in those places. What about John 11 at the raising of Lazarus? What was the Pharisees' response? We're going to have to kill this guy, or else what? Speaking of Lazarus at this point. We're going to have to kill Lazarus, or something's going to happen.
Christ was going to raise him, but
Christ had already raised him.
yeah.
That's what had them upset. So if we don't kill this guy, everyone's going to believe in this man being Jesus. And then the Romans are going to come and take everything away from us. And then the high priest made a statement, which he didn't, I don't believe he realized anything close to what he was saying. Wouldn't it be convenient for one man to die to save a whole nation? They're looking at Rome to trust them. Before Pilate, we have no king but Caesar. The relationship with the Jews and Rome is tumultuous. And we've known that throughout history. In fact, 70 AD proved it, right? Rome says, enough. I'm going to come destroy you. But if you've been paying careful attention throughout this study and are able to recall it, which is more difficult than paying attention, something has jumped out at me that before this in-depth study that I've done, I really missed. Not all of Israel dislikes Rome. It's the zealots who finally seize control and force Israel's hand to revolt against Rome. Josephus himself, a general in the Jewish army, in the Israelite army, pleaded with his people. You can't stand up against these people. Go along with them. The leadership was wealthy. It was a good arrangement for the Jews. They had to pay taxes, but they leaned on the lower classes for that. So their confidence is in two things. I think primarily Rome. And secondly, and this goes clear back to the time of Saul, their alliances. Why did Saul have so many wives? You could say, well, he had to have lots of kids. Most of his marriages were forged out of alliances to make alliances with other countries. I believe God is saying here, your allies are lost. Your allies aren't going to come to your assistance. There's no mountain, and Bob, I think that's really what you were getting at, a place to hide. There's no mountains were found, no island to flee to. It's going to come down on your head. And your friends that you've trusted in are not going to aid you. Okay, 21. The great hailstones, about, King James says, 1 talent. A talent is, it varied from one time period to another. It's anywhere from 60 to 100 pounds. The ESV, you may have caught on as I read there, said 100 pounds. Why they settled on 100 pounds, I don't know. I couldn't find any support for that, other than maybe they took in consideration the quote I'm going to read from Josephus in just a moment.
You ever been out in a hailstorm, like just a hailstone the size of a marble hurts? Can you imagine one coming down 65 to 100 pounds?
Ooh, you're right, yeah.
It would shred the trees and everything.
It would. It'd bring walls down, wouldn't it?
Yeah, wouldn't be nothing left.
Yep. And it would be devastating to a people. So, this great hailstorm, about 100 pounds, each fell from heaven on people. Now notice their response. And they cursed God for the plague of the hail, because the plague was so severe. Now, let's look. Now, the first thing that comes to mind is Exodus 9th chapter, right? 18 through 26 is where we read about the plague of hail on the Egyptians. But let's go. I want to read. This is, if you want to make a note, this is from Josephus, The Jewish Wars, Volume 1, that this quote comes from. And here's what it says. The engines that all the legions had already prepared for them were admirably contrived, but still more extraordinary ones belonged to the 10th Legion. Those that threw darts and those that threw stones were more forcible and larger than the rest, by which there was not only repelled the excursions of the Jews, but drove those away that were upon the walls also. Now the stones that were cast were of the weight of a talent. Sound familiar? And were carried 2 furlongs and further. The blow they gave was no way to be sustained, not only by those that stood first in the way, but by those that were beyond them for a great pace. So he says a weight of talent, right? And it would destroy not only those whom it hit or landed on, but those for a great pace beyond that. As for the Jews, they at first watched the coming of the stone, for it was a white color, and could therefore not only be perceived by the great noise it made, but could be seen also before it came by its brightness. Accordingly, the watchmen that sat upon the towers gave them notice when the engine would let go. And the stone came from it and carried aloud from their own country language. And before I tell you what they said, and you may remember I mentioned this last week, these stones, forgot to bring my phone up here. It's not it's not Jerry making noise, and it's not from Brenda either. These stones are white. Now, late in the siege, the Romans looked for ways to eventually get these great stones to be colored black. But here's what was really interesting, jumped out at me. Now, I see a very close resemblance between what Josephus says and what we just read. But this part in Revelation, and they cursed God for the plague of the hail. Now, all along we've been reading, God keeps saying no matter what happens to them throughout all these plagues, they don't repent and come back to God. They curse them. Here's what they yelled. So they're standing on the walls. they'd see these coming in. They need to yell something to notify everyone around them. Here's what to yell. The Son, S-O-N, cometh. The Son cometh. The Son cometh. Why? I think God causes people to prophesy in many ways. I mentioned the high priest after the resurrection of Lazarus saying something he had no idea what he was saying. He thought he had a meaning to it, but it meant something completely different. It seems most likely to me that they're mocking the Christians because they are still arrogant, and everything else that we read about the history at this point is right up till the very end. They believe there's no way that Jerusalem was going to fall. And these prophecies, Matthew 24 and others, about Jesus coming back, right? Jesus said himself to the high priest, "You will see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of God, coming in the clouds." These prophecies weren't hidden from the Jews. I believe they were mocking the Jews because as they were persecuting these Christians, they were probably hearing, he's coming back. Do with what you will with me, but he's coming back.
Yeah, but the Jew also believes the Messiah is coming back too.
They do, but I don't know that terminology, the Son, that's a uniquely Christian
It is.
term.
But who do they think's coming back? Who is this Messiah that they want to come back? Who is it?
Usually, I'm not sure what they believe now. This time, they usually were looking for three different people. They were looking for a king. They were looking for a prophet. And the prophet was who was going to suffer. And the king was going to be the one who reigned and ruled.
So that's all in one.
Yeah, they had trouble wrapping their minds around it. And rightfully so. How can you look at Isaiah 53 and see a king? Right? So they had trouble wrapping their mind. When I say rightly so, they're dead wrong.
Yeah.
But rightly so is in, you can see where that thought process would come from, I think. So I don't think they were looking for deliverance from God. I think they were relying on their own deliverance. And that's why they were gathering there. From all throughout the land, they'd been coming to Jerusalem. But that recorded history, Josephus, as you will recall, was not a Christian. It's interesting what they were yelling out. Anything else? Yes. Emily and then Bill.
Go ahead and get him.
She'll forget Bill.
No. I won't.
Or Bob, I mean. I meant Bob. She says you first, Bob.
Okay, I said the different times that the hail was used in the Bible. It was used in the 10 plagues. It was used in the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Hail was like fire coming down. So it had quite a deficit, and it destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah completely. But God did something. He does it big way.
Right. Well, and I think what's interesting there is, Bob, these were done, what's really jumped out me as we stayed through this, is they were done for a purpose. We read from Romans, Linda's not here to keep me straight, 10:4. I said that wrong, and I'm not saying that to pick on her, I'm grateful. These things were written aforetime. The things that were written aforetime were written for our learning. It's not 10:4. Why is... I'm so glad Mom's in classroom. She'd be so ashamed right now. But where is it? A couple of not...
What, things written aforetime?
Yeah.
15:4?
It said 15:4. I was 5 chapters off.
That's just a guess.
Yes. Your guess was better than my assertion. So, Bob, what I'm getting at is they set symbolic ideas up that God's relied on to come back to from that Old Testament. Emily?
Did you say the Romans made the hail black?
So the stones were white that they were, and then so they found ways of darkening. I don't know if black is too strong. They darkened the stones that they were so they couldn't be seen. So the Jews are watching them, and they're yelling, "The sun cometh! The sun cometh!" They're pointing, so they'd scatter, and it still was destructive because, like Josephus said, not only who it hits, but everything behind there is going. So when they couldn't see it coming in, they would hear Josephus in that quote I read mention the noise, so you know it's coming, but it sure is a lot harder to pick up in the sky versus a big white object. When I was young, David's running the computer in the back, but we played paintball. We found out early, you remember those days, their tanks were in your house.
I know.
We found out very early when we were playing in the woods, it was best to get black balls, paintballs, because if you were a little ways off, anything brighter, you could have just enough time to
That
die.
side of the house was green and blue. And
I don't remember what you're talking about.
You used all them on the house and saved the black ones for all. Now I know.
No comment. All right.
I'm a little
Yes.
confused though.
Go.
The Romans are throwing the hailstones on the Jews here, right?
Yes.
And they blaspheme God because the Romans are throwing it on them? And see, the way you read this, it's like God threw these on them.
Well, I think all along God is using the Romans as his agent.
Wouldn't you curse the Romans rather than the Lord? I would, if it was me. You know.
Yeah, you would think. Well, and I think if it weren't for that quote from Josephus, I'd be saying, yeah, I hear what you're saying.
Well, the Romans probably did it too.
Yeah, no doubt.
I mean, they did it, obviously.
No doubt. They were no friend to God.
I'm just confused. I don't know. I think God's throwing these down on them. I don't know. That's the way I read it.
How, and I don't disagree with what you're saying, but how different is it really if he uses matters in nature, moisture, the atmosphere and things to hurl something, or another individual? God is in control.
Oh,
Certainly.
absolutely. But when it says coming right out of heaven, you just don't think it's anything but God doing it.
Right. Right.
The way it reads to me, that's all.
Yeah, I hear you there. My thought there would be it's the symbolic language that's being used. Think of how much if this was written in words. Listen, the Romans are going to come. They're going to surround the city. They're going to hurl their stones and destroy. Now God is judging Jerusalem. They are meant to die here. Well, that would be means for the Jews to say, hey, to take Jesus' advice and get out of there. But that's not what they do.
No, they don't care for Jesus.
Yeah. So I think that symbolic language conceals, just like Jesus' parables, conceals the information from those who were not searching to find out what they meant. But certainly your point, Mike, is well taken that, with the literal language, if you take this literally, it paints a little different picture. Not little, big difference, certainly. Okay, so what we have in chapters 17 through 20, then, is a culmination of all 7 of the seals, which were judgments, all 7 of the trumpets, which were announcements, and all 7 of the chalices, which were inflictions of judgment. And what we see here is a tale of 2 cities, the Old Jerusalem and the New Jerusalem. Old Jerusalem being the physical Jerusalem, New Jerusalem being the church, right? And that ties into heaven. I think as we look at chapter 17, we have here this infamous picture of the whore, the harlot, sitting on the back of the red beast, red dragon we picture him, right? And it's such strong language, Mike, we were just talking about the symbolic language, such strong imagery, right? Of a harlot sitting on the back of this strong beast. And I believe that the Old Testament book that's being referred to very heavily throughout these next couple of chapters, certainly 17, is Hosea. Who does Hosea, let me rephrase that. Who was Hosea commanded to marry? Harlot. Gomer? Is that right? Gomer. Right? So he goes out and he retrieves her. He purchases her and says, you don't have to do this anymore. And they are married. But what does Gomer do?
She leaves.
Leaves. Goes back to harlotry. And Hosea weeps, and Hosea pursues her. He's admonished by God to pursue her. Brings her back. She leaves. What's the imagery? What is Gomer? Who does Gomer represent in that entire story? Now, God played it out. This isn't a parable. This isn't a fairy tale. God played it out in real life. But who does Gomer represent? Israel. And Hosea represents God. Now, if your spouse opens I don't know what to say other than whorehouse. It's strong language, but it's strong imagery, right? If your spouse opens a whorehouse, how many times are you going to persuade them and beg them to come away from that?
70 times 7.
Are you going to do that?
No.
Infidelity is one thing, but we're far beyond that extreme, aren't we? And that is the image that's being painted here. Now, not only has Judaism, not only has Israel been unfaithful, not only has Judaism been harlot, having prostituted herself, she's also persecuting the rightful bride. Right? Separate and apart from the book of Revelation, that is what the spiritual message we see in the Old Testament.
Persecuting what?
The true bride. Right? The church. And continues to do so fiercely. Let's look at some of this imagery, and then next week it'll allow us to get into what it means. Starting in verse 1. Then one of the 7 angels who had 7 bowls came and said to me, "Come, I will show you judgment of the great prostitute who is seated on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed sexual immorality, and with the wine of whom sexual immorality the dwellers on earth have become drunk. And he carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness, And I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names, and it had 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet and adorned with gold and jewels and pearls, holding in her hand a golden cup full of abomination and impurities of her sexual immorality. And on her forehead was written a name of mystery, Babylon the Great, mother of prostitutes and of earth's abominations. And I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints, the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. So we will recall from a couple chapters back a great woman, chapter 12, right? And she was beautiful. John looks at this woman and the angel says, "What are you gawking at?" She's adorned, this woman in 17, with all kind of fancy dress, isn't she? Is not the woman in chapter 12 adorned with fancy, amazing attire? What kind of attire do we see in chapter 12, though? She is. Kevin's nodding his head yes, and he's absolutely right. We can look in verse 1. A woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. All of her beauty is celestial from above. Notice what this woman is adorned with. That is what Jerusalem should have been adorned with. Beauty from above. But look at what she was adorned with. 4. The woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet and adorned with gold and jewels, holding in her hand a golden cup. Right? None of it celestial. It's all physical. And Jerusalem had sold themselves out to pursuing the things of this world. That woman, by the way, is sitting on many waters. Remember, waters had to do with Gentiles. I mentioned their alliances earlier. Their trust was in their physical alliances. Take time, if you would, read through chapter 17, and we'll delve into it next